This is Talking Drupal, a weekly chat about web design and development from a group of people with one thing in common. We love Drupal. This is episode 330, Remote Development on a LAN. Welcome to Talking Drupal. Today we're talking about remote development on LAN with Stephen Cross. Stephen is a former host of Talking Drupal, a Drupal developer with the federal government, a fellow NetCamp organizer, and Linux advocate. Stephen, welcome back to the show, and thank you for joining us for your final week as a guest host.
It's almost over. I'm so sad.
Yeah, I was going to say, this is giving me flashbacks of episode 300.
It's okay. In another 30 episodes, you can come back, apparently.
Yeah, maybe every multiple of 30.
I was thinking the end of the year, but we'll see.
That might work too.
Sure.
So I'm Nick Laughlin, and today my co-hosts are, as usual, John Picozzi. What's new with you this week?
So this is actually, I think, an update that is 2 weeks old. But I watched a movie, which is I don't know. People do that. There's a movie on Netflix called Don't Look Up, and I don't know. If you're a listener and if you've watched it, you're like, yes, okay, cool. You know what I'm talking about. But basically, Don't Look Up is a movie with Leonardo DiCaprio and Jennifer Lawrence. Thank you. And it is basically they are scientists, and they find that there is a huge asteroid on a collision course with Earth. And the movie goes through their trials and tribulations with telling the U.S. government that this is happening, and then kind of what happens around that. It is, it's just great. It's a great commentary on different viewpoints of a global problem, and whatever your political belief is, right? I think you can watch this movie and kind of laugh at the fact that there are varying viewpoints and varying motives to how they handle the problem. So I don't want to spoil it for anybody. So I will leave it there. But yeah, I highly recommend it.
I do need to say
it's listed as a comedy disaster film.
Yeah,
it's absolutely a comedy disaster film.
Yeah. I do want to say it was filmed in Worcester, and so that's one of the reasons why we watched it. And the writer and director grew up in Worcester.
Oh, so you've seen it?
Yeah.
I enjoyed it. What was your? You enjoyed it? Okay.
It's pretty clear that it's an allegory on climate change. You know, the way that people are responding to this kind of existential threat is kind of exactly how the world has responded to climate change. You know, I definitely enjoyed it. There are a lot of laughs and a lot of kind of existential horror as you're watching the movie.
Did you feel sad at the end of it? As far as like, oh, this is like totally how human beings operate, and like, it makes me sad.
It's one of those things where the movie was written before COVID. But I think if you had watched it before, it was written and mostly produced, I think, and before COVID. But if it had been released as
I think it was filmed. I think it was filmed during COVID.
Correct.
But it was,
I think what I read.
The script and everything was written before. But I think if you had seen it before COVID, it would have been a bit more absurd comedy. You were like, nope, nobody would react like this. But some of the stuff in the movie, you're like, well, 5 years ago, it'd be like nobody would have reacted this way to something like this. But now I know.
I don't.
For sure.
I don't necessarily. I think
that. Not every last detail of the movie. There's some instances there where I'm like, I definitely would have thought that's out of the realm of possibility. But now I can see people.
Fair enough. Yeah, fair enough. I mean, I think.
But yeah,
I recommend it. Go watch it. It's a fun time. A couple hours, I think it is.
Yeah, and we definitely enjoyed it because just part of it because of the Worcester connection. So
I didn't realize it was a requirement for us to watch that before this episode. I would have done it. So
Well, now you know what you can watch it and then record a short review and send it in.
It's funny, when I was away on vacation one night, I was laying in bed. We were pretty tired while we were away in Arizona, and got to bed early every night. And one night I said, let me put this movie on. So I had my phone in bed. I put it on. I think I lasted 5 minutes. And so that was my extent of seeing that film. So I have to go back to it.
Oh yeah. That's the first 5 minutes, not a lot going on there.
Also joining us this week, Stephen Cross. What's new with you this week?
Hey, so as my last week on the show for, I don't know, the next 12 months or so, maybe, I was compelled to put a lot of stuff in my weekly updates. I had 4 items in here at one point and slowly narrowed it down. John was strong arming me a bit, I think, to keep this list small. I'll bring this up because I think it's related to our topic today, which is Docker Desktop is no longer free. So if this is news to you, if you're a Windows user or a Mac user and you use Docker Desktop, as of January 31st, if you work for a company larger than 250 people or an organization or the government, you now have to pay for a license for Docker Desktop.
How much is that license?
I don't know. Didn't look at it. I think it's like $5 a person, kind of thing, a month.
First question is, how are they determining if you work for an organization? Is it like honor system?
Yeah, so go and look. So the way I figure it out, because it does impact the work that I do as I work for the federal government, there's an FAQ page that will go in the show notes. And doesn't look like I've listed it here, but I'll make sure I put it in there. There's an FAQ page on Docker's website that clearly answers, if I'm in this situation, does it apply to me? If I'm in this situation, does it apply to me? But basically, if you work for a company and you're using Docker, it applies to you. Period. That's pretty much the way it is. So I was curious, John, has this come up in your company at all?
It has come up with some clients.
Okay.
It has not. I've not actually directly discussed it with anybody, simply because I was not aware that it would. So, I use Lando, and Lando uses Docker.
It requires Docker. It requires Docker Desktop on a Mac. When you install Lando,
right,
it actually installs Docker Desktop for you.
Right. So that inherently means that I use Docker Desktop, right? So I actually wasn't aware that the deadline was looming at the end of this month. So I will have to look into that and see what our path forward is for that. So
I wasn't aware of this at all. So I'm on Linux. So this is not an issue for any Linux users. It's for Mac and Windows people. But I saw on Slack over the weekend, I saw some chatter about testing out open source versions of Docker Desktop because of the upcoming licensing issue. And I was like, I wonder what this is about. And I started to look at it and then realized this was announced back in August and is now like happening at the end of the month. So there are some considerations. There are some open source options for you. I know DDev is already addressed this in their current release, that they have integrated with an open source product called Colima, Colima. Colima. Oh yeah, because it uses Lima as its all right, that makes sense now, because Lima is the virtualization system it uses. So this is Colima, makes perfect sense. They've integrated to it already, and it seems to be working great. Which is basically a drop-in replacement of Docker Desktop. So while it's not Docker, it's using virtualization in the same way, and it replaces like the Docker command on your system. And like initial testing looks like it all works well. So there are options for people. There's another product called podman.io that looks like has some promise.
I want to use that one just because it sounds cool.
So that looks like there's a lot of, if you do some Google searching, you'll see there's been a lot of activity about this topic since the announcement back in August from Docker. So take a look at it. I use Lando. Lando doesn't have a solution. They are like looking at like adding this to the 4.0, the 4.x version, but there doesn't seem to be a lot of activity on this site about making this happen yet.
Mhm.
I mean, I imagine that's going to cause a mass migration.
I do. Yeah. Big problem. It makes me wonder about, should I be shifting over to DDev, to be honest, because they seem to be very active in sort of keeping up with trends like this and issues like this. So just take a look. It could be impacting your company. Not a good idea to get caught on the illegal license side if you could avoid it. So take a look.
Not advocating for that. Okay.
No, not a good idea.
I mean, a lot of my clients are smaller than 250, so they'll probably fit in the exception, but I'd rather, I'll take a look and see what I'm going to do. But
yeah, that FAQ page, the
DDev,
FAQ page is very helpful to answer most of your questions.
So for me this week, I've got a couple of updates, a couple of fun updates. So I think we might have mentioned this on the show last week. We had some snow coming in, and last Friday we got about 6 to 8 inches of snow. And then Saturday or Sunday it warmed up a bit, so the snow got really sticky and ended up being perfect snowman making snow. And since my in-laws are here and they really haven't had that experience, actually it turns out Joanna either, I never made a snowman with her. So we made a nice big snowman. It was a lot of fun, and there'll be a picture in the newsletter. So if you want to take a look at that, I think it's the biggest snowman I've actually ever made. It was pretty fun. And then kind of a trend for the last few weeks. I'm going to give you guys an update on the computer situation. So where we left it off last week, the computer wouldn't post. I got the DRAM light. I had tried some new RAM. That didn't work. So I'd done an RMA and replaced the CPU and motherboard with the same model, just assuming one of them was bad, and had the same issue. And so I did a little bit more research and kind of decided that the most likely culprit was an incompatible motherboard, because the odds of 2 motherboards, 2 CPUs, and 2 different sets of RAM all being bad is very, very low. So I ended up just purchasing a different model of motherboard that had a slightly newer chip. And that arrived actually very quickly, arrived the next day. And put everything again for the 3rd or 4th time using the new motherboard, same CPU, and everything booted as expected.
Oh, so some VR fun over at your house.
So we've spent the last few nights playing Beat Saber, and it's been and doing some of the various VR, like roller coasters and things like that. So we've been having a lot of fun, and we've been having some fun doing some turning on, giving somebody the expert plus on some songs. And just enjoying like the absolute insanity that the difficulty rise from like hard to expert plus is extremely steep. And so you go from having 1 or 2 beats per second to 15 to 20. It feels like it's just like a wall of action. And so we've been having a lot of fun that way.
So where is this set up, Nick, for you?
It's set up downstairs because that's kind of the only space that we have.
I was going to ask, have there been any casualties in like VR breakage of items in the room?
No items. I did punch the ceiling and cut myself, but so I plan on, but I'm also the tallest out of everybody, so nobody else really reaches the ceiling. So I think I'm going to put some padding up there to protect myself, but nothing major. I'm going to have to figure out a more permanent solution, but for now, I kind of just got it set up and running and having some fun.
VR in the backyard.
We'll figure out, it might not be a bad idea. Figure out a way to, the problem is there's a lot of really long cables and a lot of things need power. So it's a bit difficult, but we'll figure something out.
And nobody's motion sick from this.
Nobody yet. No.
Oh, interesting.
So it's been good.
I feel like I would probably be the one to get motion sick from that, but maybe not.
Yeah, we'll see as I get more experience with it. It's definitely been an adventure. Looking forward to kind of figuring out how to really get to kind of the best experience. Getting, like, even just turning it on sometimes takes a little bit of work. Like if something doesn't sync, you have to figure out, like, start over. Like there's multiple layers of programs you have to have running. Like you have to turn on the VR experience and then turn on the game. And if you do things out of order, like it's one of those things where once you figure it out, it's like, oh, you do this, then it's done. But I've got myself in a couple of situations where it takes me 5 or 10 minutes to figure out how to get.
Doesn't like tell you like, oh, you got to go turn this thing on first.
No, like for example, like the left hand controller didn't pair for some reason. So I spent some time like hitting buttons and trying to turn it on and off, and that didn't work. And then I figured, oh, if you click on it in the program, then there's an option to repair it and pair it again rather. And then you hold down a combination of buttons and it works. So it's one of those things where once you know what to do, it's like, oh, it takes 3 seconds and you're good to go. But the first time it happens, you don't know what happened. So
sounds like a switch problem.
Yeah, but it's been a good time. The other last thing I'll say about this, the other really interesting thing is how quickly somebody who's not used to games or computers can pick up a VR game versus something else. Like my mother-in-law, I mean, we played Mario Kart, but she's got the options on, so it's like on rails. Like the car goes and won't fall off a cliff no matter what. So she'll get to the end. Like she has fun, but she's not a gamer. But you put the VR headset on, give her the handles, and she's not the greatest at Beat Saber because she's not a gamer, but she, like, within 30 seconds, she kind of intuitively knew what to do and was like hitting the right color, really following the beat. And
it's a lot more
and
intuitively,
immediately intuitively picked up what to do. And so I was kind of worried, like having, because you have to hold the remotes, you have to have the headset on. I was worried that it would be a bit too much or motion sickness or something. But like I said, you like immediately.
Nick, how does that setup that you have, that you spent months with hardware and configuration and buying new equipment and everything, how does that compare to one of those sets that's self-enclosed, that you just kind of buy it for $300 and it like sits on its own and connects to your network? What is like the difference in VR for those?
So my understanding is the Vive, which I think is HTC's version, is similar to the Index in that it needs a computer, like an actual high-powered computer to handle all the VR stuff. It's a lot cheaper than the Index, but it has a lot lower quality, both in the visual aspect of the VR, like the refresh rate and stuff, as well as the pairing and like fidelity of where you are. But it's significantly cheaper. The Oculus, I think it's the Oculus, the newest Oculus has some.
That's what I'm talking about.
Or it might be the Quest, actually. I think the Quest has some built-in VR stuff, so you can do some games without really having high-powered equipment. It's also cheaper, but I forget who owns the Quest. I know Oculus is owned by...
It's Oculus. It's Oculus.
Oh, Quest. Oculus is Quest. Yeah, so it's owned by Facebook, and I have no intention of ever having Facebook hardware in my house. Never mind. Like I don't even have the website. But my understanding is the Oculus can be standalone for some games. It's a lot cheaper. But basically, I went with the Index because it has the highest quality experience, and then as far as like the visual effects and the fidelity of the movement, and then it requires a kind of a standalone computer to work. I am planning on using this computer, by the way, to render the show, because I have a feeling it will render significantly faster than
because it's on Windows, or because it's got better hardware.
Better hardware.
Yeah.
It's got a significantly better.
Wait, that wasn't a joke.
No, wasn't a joke.
Why would
Yeah.
Windows render better or faster?
Oh, I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know.
That's what I was
know why it
asking.
would either.
Yeah.
But no, it has a significantly better
Yeah.
processor, so it should render faster. Anyway, what was meant to be a quick update has turned into 10 minutes.
The show.
So,
Thank you all for joining.
I expect nothing less from you, Nick.
So we do have a module of the week. It's one of those modules where we definitely mentioned in the past, but I don't think we've given the full treatment. So the module of the week this week is the external links module. And it's one of those modules that just has a little function that it does for you with a couple of configurations that just takes care of a problem. And the two main things that it does for you is it allows you to open external links in a new tab, and it allows you to indicate to the user using an icon whether something is an external link or a mail to link or something like that. I find that most clients, especially design-oriented clients, don't like the icons. But it's just a checkbox, so you can shut that off. But a lot of clients want you to be able to open, make sure all links that are external just open in a window. This also allows you to configure a kind of whitelist internal links, so to speak. So, for example, if you have a site where there's multiple websites part of the organization, and they want them all to be treated as internal, even though they're technically separate domains, you can configure those in external links, and external links won't treat those as external. And so they would just open in the same tab. It is available for version 7, 8, and 9. It's been around since 2007, and it has 70,000 installs. So it's a fairly well supported module.
Yeah, I use it all the time. And I think I may be misremembering it, or this may be a different module, but I think they've actually added functionality to be able to pop a message for external links too. I don't know if that's part of external links.
Speed bump, like a speed bump kind of thing. You're leaving the website message.
Exactly. Yeah, I think they added that feature because that is a lot of corporate clients sometimes require that. But yeah, external links is the way to go. Super useful.
Nick, is external links like a add-in to the WYSIWYG that you're using a special button to add these links, or is it a text format that's at the rendering point?
None of the above. It's basically just a module that layers on a JavaScript or jQuery script that looks at all your links and applies the appropriate action to them based on the configuration of the module.
So it requires JavaScript to be on, and so it doesn't play wrong with any of the other link things that you might do. Yeah,
I don't know. I don't actually know. I don't know if I've never tested it with JavaScript off, so I don't know if it.
Well, it says it uses jQuery.
Yeah, I can't imagine that it would work. Right. But then again, I don't know many sites that actually work really well without JavaScript anyway. So most of my clients, it's not a concern.
All my clients, it's a requirement. So all the sites that I'm working on work very well without JavaScript.
Interesting. So this function would not work. Well, the site would work. The link would work. It just wouldn't.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, this is an added feature, right? It doesn't mean the links are broken. Right.
Yep. Exactly. Nice. We have the global contribution sprint coming up, and we have Martin here to give you a little bit of information about that.
Hi, everyone. My name is Martin Anderson-Klutz from Acquia, and in the Drupal community, I go by ManClue. I'm here to talk to you about Drupal Global Contribution Weekend coming up January 28th to 30th. It's your chance to give back to the Drupal community, and you don't have to be a developer to help. You can contribute by testing patches, updating documentation, even writing issue summaries. With Drupal 10 just months away, this is your chance to help shape the next major version. And the great thing about open source is that you can scratch your own itch. So find some issues you're passionate about and help move them along. Visit the link in the show notes to find a sprint, and we'll see you there. And if you can't find one close to you, organize one. There's a link for that too.
Well, thank you, Martin. And if any of you are interested in contributing during the global sprint. We'll have links in the show notes and the newsletter that gives you the information that he was mentioning so that you can get involved. So let's move on to our primary topic. So our topic this week is about remote development over a LAN. What does that mean?
Well, LAN is a local area network. I know that much.
I remember having LAN parties when I was a teenager, and I would haul around this giant 24-inch CRT in my computer to my cousin's house so we could have a LAN party and play Dota, the original Dota.
Well, it sounds a little contradictory. Remote development on your LAN, and it's intended to be like that. But the idea is to set up your local development environment with remote development mindset. So thinking about doing remote development, but doing it on your local area network.
So, okay, I got to ask the dumb question. What do you mean, or what is remote development?
Yeah, so remote development's becoming a more hot topic, or maybe only because I've been looking at it. But have you guys heard like people talking about remote development?
So
just curious.
Survey. So do you mean, when you say remote development, do you mean like a developer is accessing a system that is not theirs to develop some piece of code, something like Gitpod or something like that?
Yeah, so you're working not on your local machine, but you're working on a remote machine to do coding.
Yes.
That's really what it is, in essence.
Yeah, I've definitely heard of that. And I do that sometimes, but usually not with work client work. It's usually with like side hobby projects.
So we're gonna get really into it here, because like I'm now thinking about this as a like remote development without leaving your house, or without the information leaving your house. Like let's talk in more detail.
Well, I think one of the primary benefits of having it on the LAN is you don't need an internet connection. Well, beyond the general, if you're working on something, as long as everything is pulled down, you don't need an internet connection for it to work. So if you're pulling down new packages or something, then obviously you need an internet connection for that. But if the remote server, for example, is at a client's location or an AWS or something like that, if you don't have an internet connection, you can't work.
Right. So like, I mean, if you're writing code, right, I think one of the biggest hurdles with remote development, right, is that if you're writing code, you need access an internet connection to that remote environment. So this effectively eliminates that, right? You have, as long as you are connected to your network, you have the ability to kind of keep moving on. As Nick said, if you need outside packages, that could be a different story. But yeah, it kind of removes that limitation of kind of like standard remote development solutions, right?
Yeah, I think you've both sort of nailed it. And I did mention the word mindset, because doing remote development is a mindset of like where you're thinking about where your tools sit versus where the code sits, where the code runs. And I think working in a remote development environment on your LAN gets you in that mindset that at some point in time, I think we will all be doing remote development. It's in some degree, and working in that model already in your local area, in your local network, allows you to really easily take that like remote part and move it out to the cloud, and your workflow stays the same. That's sort of what the concept is.
So before we move on to the next question, I'm curious, when did this come on your radar, Stephen? When did you start thinking about remote development?
Yeah, so it came up for me in sort of a really roundabout way, in that in the team that I work with in the federal government, we were trying to solve a really particular problem. And that was, we have a mixed environment with users or developers working on Macs and developers working in Linux. And there was a big discrepancy between the performance of the development environments for the Mac people versus the ones for the Linux people. So we've talked about this on this show before, and I think probably most of our listeners are very aware that Docker does not run great on a Mac. There are solutions to it, but like out of the box, it's just a poor performer. And back in 2020, we had just purchased some new MacBook Pros, like high performance, state of the art Mac computers. And we were seeing that running our Drupal environments, specifically Lando, so a Docker containers, and doing what we would be using. We use BLT, which is a framework for deploying applications built by Acquia. That's what we use. And we would see that like an artifact build, which is a process of building the entire site locally and deploying it on an outside platform. Running that on a Mac was taking 20 minutes, and running it on a Linux machine was taking 30 seconds. So it got us to start to wonder, like, we need to, like, this difference between the performance is so bad. Is there some way we can alleviate some of this pressure? So developers who are comfortable in Mac and want to stay on Mac, is there a way they could develop so they can push code to the repository in 30 seconds versus 20 minutes? And that's kind of what started me down this path of looking at what this is all about, and what turned out to be what I thought would be LAN development. I was thinking we were only going to be working on, like, how do we solve this problem in a LAN environment? And then as I walked through the solutions, I found that this is really remote development in a LAN environment. And as we walk through today, we can sort of clarify what that means.
I just want to point out too, based on your update today, that not only do you have a worse experience on a Mac, you now have to also pay for pay for that too.
Yeah, those licenses are being purchased as we speak, by the way.
well, that might be something that would fix this too, because if you're working remotely on a Linux box, Linux doesn't need Docker for desktop.
Yeah, Docker for desktop goes away. Unfortunately, we're not at the point, and we can talk about this later on in the show, of some of the limitations with this strategy. One of them is, how do you do mobile development? Like, for someone who is working on a laptop and spends 80% of the time in the office, but 20% on the road, what do they do? And I think they still need some of their remote tools, or like local tools like Docker Desktop. They may still need.
Yeah, that was going to be kind of one of my questions here, was like, how does this? So this is like on a LAN, so it's individual to the person, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
You know, obviously, if somebody's in an office sharing the same LAN connection, like, they could all work on the same machine, or the same remote machine or remote instance. But so are you saying that everybody on your team has their own kind of like remote development environment locally at their house?
Yeah. So to frame this discussion a little bit, that's a good point, John, is that I approach this from solving people working remotely from their homes, trying to solve this problem. Not necessarily a team working environment, although I think this gets you very close to a team environment working with remote development servers, which we were nowhere near prior to implementing this. And I think most people work like this today, is that they have their own local environment that they work with, like you probably do, John and Nick, that like your local environment is what you work with, and then you push code through repositories, probably Git pushes and stuff that pushes code out to other people, which works really well. I did have a unique use case where I was trying to solve this problem with performance, but that did open up this avenue to say, hey, remote development is something that actually could happen with some of the tools we have today.
So what are some of the key concepts that came out of this research you're doing, like high level questions that you have to solve?
Yeah, so what we're trying to do is not force people to use a desktop environment they weren't comfortable using, right? So the concept being, use the best tools for the job for you as a developer. So for some people, like for me, I'm perfectly comfortable in Linux. I love the Linux environment. That's good for me as a desktop. There's other developers who prefer Mac, which is the majority of Drupal developers have Macs. They're comfortable in that environment and they like those tools that they use. So the key concept here was, how can we put an environment together where they use the best tool for the job? So a desktop of choice, Linux, Mac, or Windows. But really for a LAMP stack development, the best place that belongs is in a Linux environment. Like Linux is the place that you really want to be running your websites. That's where most of them are deployed. And most production websites are running on Linux, or part of their stack in running is on Linux. So it's the best place for development to be done, but it's not necessarily the place for that developers want to sit and spend their time all day. So the basic concept is have a Linux computer that has your LAMP stack, your code, and your Git repository. Then you have your own desktop computer, whether that be Mac, Linux, or Windows, that basically has three primary tools: the browser, the IDE, your coding utility, and a terminal. And splitting those two things up. And when you split them up, you let the best tool do the best thing.
Now, have you experimented at all with with the IDE living within the Linux environment?
Yeah, so it's a little bit of jump ahead there for us, but I think what I found, and a bit of this discussion is about the journey that I took on to get to this. But at the end of the day, if we jump to what the best situation is for the using an IDE that is primarily running on the remote machine with a GUI front end that you're using is really the best approach to this.
And are you using like an IDE in the browser at that point, or is there a different way to?
No, just an IDE. So in my case, it's VS Code.
So let's talk about the benefits. Let's talk about benefits and challenges, but let's first start with the benefits that you're seeing from this type of setup. We've kind of talked through a couple of them, as far as like fast development and increasing speed of development. But what other benefits have you seen from this kind of setup?
So some of them are real tangible benefits. Like I mentioned earlier, the performance increase. When you run stuff on Linux, if you're a LAMP stack guy, it runs fast. So performance is a huge benefit of this, one of the key ones. Some less tangible benefits in terms of numbers are developers learning new tools. So having a working knowledge of Linux, I think, is super beneficial, and we're almost at the point of being required for anyone in our space, that you need some working knowledge to be able to deal with problems and get into a command line and feel comfortable with starting things and exploring things and installing packages. When you put this kind of local environment into someone's workspace, they're forced to learn Linux, which is not necessarily a bad thing, as long as they're willing to do it. So I think it's a really great way to introduce Linux to developers who have sort of been a little standoffish in the past. I think if you look into a lot of agencies, you'll often see that there's the DevOps guy who handles the DevOps stuff. And then sometimes you'll have developers who do the development side, and they push away from the DevOps side. They basically get this package that they install on their computer, and as long as it runs, they work. And the minute something goes wrong with it, they kind of wait for this DevOps guy to chip in and get help from him. But this approach is putting a little bit more of the burden, I think, back onto the developer to say, hey, learn a little bit of this stuff because it will help you a bit. So it's really introducing the Linux into the day-to-day workflow. It's also about getting comfortable in this remote development environment where your code isn't on your computer that you're used to seeing when you click the folder and just like, let me look at the code. It's sitting somewhere else that you have to connect to look at. So it's about getting comfortable in that environment. So I think the benefits are great. There certainly are a few drawbacks that we can get to later, but for those who want to learn Linux and learn a little bit more about networking and like explore this remote development environment, this is a great way to start it out without fully jumping into remote development.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of other benefits too. Even if you're talking about strictly remote on LAN, if you have multiple computers that are connecting, like, you know, you and I both have a laptop and a desktop, but sometimes you need to jump on the laptop to finish something, you know, maybe after hours. Mm-hmm. You know, having a remote repository that you're working from means that whatever you left off on your desktop is what your laptop is working on. So you don't have to worry about syncing your different computers or redoing something. It's just there. And the same thing kind of goes for security and backing up. You only have to back up that one thing. You no longer have to back up multiple. I mean, you should be backing up everything. Like, that's just best practice. But as far as work goes, you're not having to worry about backing up multiple locations and syncing them. You kind of have one repository for that information and securing it. You know, you can make sure that the security of the remote environment is higher, and you know, you're going to protect that information there as well.
Also potential there to be remotely managed, right? So like your employer could send you the device and say, plug this into your network and do like these 3 steps. And then like now there's a remote managed device on your network that your organization can push updates to, or even think of it from the laptop theft aspect of it, right? Now you don't have to worry about that code being out in the wild if a laptop goes missing for some reason.
Exactly.
It's interesting because in sort of, I would call my workshop here where I've been testing these things, it got to the point that once I like figured out this model that was working, my core like development environment is sitting on basically a headless Linux box. And I can code from, as long as I can get a network connection to it, I can code from any device.
Yeah.
Like I did coding for 4 days from a Raspberry Pi as an experiment. That I basically worked on a Raspberry Pi as my desktop because the power was coming from the remote server for all of that stuff that never changed. In a Raspberry Pi, as limited as it is, I could install VS Code, I had a browser, and I had a terminal. And when you think about it from what you need to work from, that's all you need. Once you connect to that remote space, the power in terms of like building and deploying and doing that stuff is sitting on a Linux box. So there's tons of flexibility in that environment when you start to think about it. So it makes your desktop environment less critical to the process. You can almost use anything. I imagine a Chromebook would even work.
Yep.
Which makes the applications here, I think, a lot. We're talking about benefits, but I mean, the applications here for this could be great in an academic or an educational setting, right? Where students are learning how to do things. I mean, I think every student in my son's class has a Chromebook, right? Being able to connect to a remote development environment and kind of do some live coding exercises would be kind of interesting. I want to switch focuses a little bit. We just talked about benefits. Obviously, we can see quite a few of them. I'm wondering what, if any, challenges you identified.
one challenge. So there's a couple of challenges that jump out to me. So outside of the challenges I had starting 8 months ago, working through this process and ending where I was, which was a bunch of challenges, and some different technologies I looked at, which we can talk about in a few minutes. But I think at the end of the day, there were two primary ones. One is the mobile office environment, because most people, not most people, so the people I targeted this for, which was my team, they're working remotely from home. So they have basically have a laptop. We furnish them with a Linux computer in a Nook. So they basically have a headless Linux computer that they're doing this environment, doing the setup with, and it's working beautifully. The question is what happens when they go back to the office or have to work? And my team, we all convene in Washington, D.C. during non-COVID times, once a month for 3 or 4 days. So at some point that will start again. And what will happen to these developers at that point? Our approach has been this: we're not completely replacing what you were doing prior to this. We're just doing it better when we're in the office. So the idea is you still have your environments that stand alone on your laptop that you could use. But if you want to work, X 50 times faster, then you kind of use this Linux remote environment. That's the approach we've taken so far. And go ahead.
Yeah. I was going to say, I see two things as an outsider looking in, so maybe this isn't feasible, but I see two solutions to this. One is when you're in the office, you just need one remote environment. You don't need individual headless servers. You just need one slightly bigger Linux server that people can connect to, and you need a way to sync that environment with their local Nook. I think you said it was Nook. And if somebody's remote, they're not in the office, but they're not home, you just need a way to VPN back to their network so that they can connect to their Nook. And then, then the internet connection is required. But again, we're working on the internet. That's kind of a requirement in general, even if you're working locally.
So I agree with those two approaches. And one I've tested and I've done, which is I've set up a VPN in my local office. So if I'm outside the office, I can actually VPN in, and it works exactly the same as if I'm sitting here. There's no difference whatsoever. The other approach is more complicated in my work environment. With the federal government, it's not like super easy to set up these servers that people can connect to. And it's an infrastructure problem that is outside the scope of something that I can address. Right. So we're in the situation where we don't have the DevOps to do that kind of solution, but it's certainly a viable one for other people.
So, well, I was going to say, I bet you that's probably the biggest hurdle that people run into is convincing their employers that getting a second computer for building is worthwhile. Like I imagine a lot of people are going to be like, hey, we just spent $3,500 per team member to buy this top of the line MacBook. Yeah. Why do we have to spend an additional $500 to get this other computer? And, and I imagine that discussion is a hard one.
Sure. It was a discussion I had 3 years ago when I was trying to convince the team I work with that we should allow Linux as a solution for developers, because we all had Macs at the time, and it was a challenge to say, hey, here's the benefits of Linux, here's the performance differences, and these are the cost differences. And we were able to move our department from Mac only to, hey, you now have a choice of Mac or Linux. The interesting thing with this whole thing is that Linux is so fast and Docker runs so well on it that you really could buy a used computer for $100 and it will outperform the Linux environment running on a Mac computer. It just does. So and certainly, I'm not suggesting that corporations will have a policy of people buying things from eBay and putting them in their home offices. That's not what I'm saying here, but I'm just trying to give a little bit of insight into like, it doesn't take a lot to do what we're trying to do. And this probably doesn't, what I'm suggesting today might not fit right for corporate environments right now. But I think for like independent people who are trying to get to those goals that I mentioned earlier about, I want to learn more Linux, I want to do things a little faster, this is definitely an approach you can start to take.
So one challenge that I was kind of, well, you had mentioned it as a benefit, but I was wondering if there was a challenge associated with it, right? You talked about team members needing to learn more, needing to learn more Linux and needing to learn maybe potentially more command line, right? Was there a challenge there where, you know, people were either having a hard time learning Linux or having a hard time doing more on the command line if that wasn't something they were familiar with?
Yeah, John, I think you just like pinpointed the other big hurdle. And I'm not necessarily saying this was a big hurdle for me, but I could see issues with it. And this is based on my experience. If you have people who are not interested in learning command line, forcing them down that route with a solution like this will not be a good experience for them or for you as a team. So like this kind of setup, I think, is best in an optional way for people to work, not a required way to work.
I think the problem with that is the productivity at that point. Like if you have, say, for example, you have to build, I'm not sure how often you have to build your projects, but say you have to build your project 6 times a day.
Yeah.
Right. 6 times a day is 2 hours of downtime for that particular developer versus 2 minutes for somebody else that's on Linux. So it becomes a question of, you know, from management's perspective.
It does. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's valid. I also think that people are probably not sitting there and watching it, right? So they know if it's going to take. And I mean, I don't know. I've never had a Lando build take 20 minutes, but I mean, I imagine if you have a lot of different environments and a lot of different setups and configuration, that it could get to that size. But you know, I don't think people are just sitting there watching it. I think they're probably doing other things with that time, knowing that it's going to take a little while. One other, and I think this is probably a challenge of remote development overall, not just this configuration, but I think the lack of internet connection is something that, you know, makes this very difficult, right? So as you said, you know, you're not going all in on this as far as like people still have locals set up on their local machines. But like, you know, I always envision I'm on an airplane, the internet is either non-existent or spotty. Like this then becomes a scenario where now I have to go back to that local machine and maybe things are taking a little bit longer. Is that accurate, or is that, you know, is there a way around that I'm missing?
Well, I think what I'm proposing here, though, is not that at all. Like the proposal in this discussion today is not doing remote development over the internet. It's just doing it on your LAN. It is not, so the internet is not involved at all. I'm suggesting that a great way to do development with mixed computers and work in a remote like environment, but not be remote, is to set this up in your local area network. Okay. So I'm not suggesting that you spin up a droplet and do your coding up there. What I'm suggesting is you set up your local environment as if you had set up a droplet, but you're actually working in your own environment. So this isn't about flying and coding on an airplane.
Right. So it's basically like, hey, I have 6 computers, you know, and I have one remote. You laugh, but I actually have 5 computers on my desk right now. So
that's not what I was laughing about. I was laughing about is you can do that on the airplane. You just need to bring your laptop, your router.
Yeah. Well, no, but but so you
and
have
a remote computer.
but you have you have 5 computers. You have the ability to do this on your network, right? And then maybe you have a 6th computer that is your travel computer that has this all locally that you can kind of pick up and take with you when the time comes. So okay, that makes a lot.
But John, you've hit on like one of the key points of this. A lot of people like us don't have one computer. They have multiple computers.
Sure.
This is a way of looking at doing that a little better and a little different.
Yep.
As opposed to having like 3 of the computers having all the stuff on them, and you could do everything with them all the time, to like divvying up the chores of those computers in a little different way.
Even if you think of computer setup, right? Like being able to say like, oh, I don't have to set up Lando or Docker or any of that stuff. I can just like open my ID, open my command line tool, and like off to the races. Here I go,
Yep, that's it. Yep.
And being realistic, the truth is many times our work requires internet connection, even if you're doing stuff locally. And if you're on an airplane and it's spotty, like I have clients that fly, and they're always like, yeah, I'm going to try to get some work done. And then the flight's over, like, yeah, I couldn't get connected, so nothing get done. So that's a problem that exists with or without this solution. So as we near the end, I'm kind of curious about lessons learned over the last, sounds like 6 to 8 months that you've been really digging into this. What are some of the key results of this experiment with your team?
So there's really 3 key pieces of technology here that matter. And when you're looking at this from the desktop side, that there's 3 pieces that need to happen. One is you need to be able to SSH into a machine. That's pretty straightforward. You set up a Linux computer. And I just say that so casually, just set up a Linux computer. So that could be like making people cringe when I say that. But all that computer really needs is open SSH, so you can connect to it from other computers in your local area network. And then you're really up and running with that. So that's one piece. The other piece is you need your IDE. In your IDE, so I'm using VS Code, which was critical to the final solution here. A lot of us use PHP Storm. I think it does something very, very similar that I'm going to talk about in a few minutes. But you have an IDE that needs access to the code that's sitting on the Linux machine. My first approach to doing this, which I spent many months working on, not to set it up, but just to troubleshoot issues that were coming up, is to create a shared folder on the Linux machine that the Mac could get to. And there's really 2 solutions there. One is an NFS solution. Another one is SMB or Samba solution. And without going into too much detail here, at the end of the day, those 2 cause too much trouble. Even on a local area environment, the Mac is not super friendly to connect to remote folders on a LAN. And there's just lots of issues with having a comfortable environment for a developer to work in that environment all day. Without it disconnecting and the Mac falling asleep and disconnecting from the Wi-Fi network and all kinds of issues. So I came to the conclusion that NFS, while I could get it to work with lots of tweaking, NFS and Samba just weren't going to work on a fly. And I actually found a solution through VS Code, which is called Remote SSH. Don't know if you guys are familiar with this, but there's a feature in VS Code called Remote SSH. It's a plugin that you can install, and it basically connects to an SSH server and gives you access to, update files like you're connected to them. And I had tried this many years ago with other editors where I'm SSHing into a machine, and those solutions would copy the files down to your local machine. Every time you'd hit save, it would copy it back up to the remote server, which was really slow and cumbersome, didn't work.
Stephen, I'm having flashbacks to setting up an FTP server in Dreamweaver and moving
Exactly.
files around.
Right.
Tell me it's better than that.
So about 2 months ago, my mind was blown by this feature, and has really what has changed me to think of this as remote development now is because the VS Code Remote SSH, what it does is when you connect it to an SSH connection, as long as you have permissions on that server to do things. So it's not just like an SFTP. So it's a true SSH connection where you have like root permissions or some higher level permissions on that server. As soon as you establish it, VS Code installs a VS Code server onto that remote machine. So it basically flips your environment where VS Code is running on the remote machine and your local machine is now just the GUI. So what's happening is you're getting local performance over a remote connection because all it's passing back and forth through the SSH connection is the visual updates to your UI. It's doing all the heavy lifting on the remote machine.
And I just want to point out that Code Server also runs in Docker, and this is how I do my remote development. Like I've got a Code Server. You just connect to the browser, and all my home automation stuff and Docker stuff for my house is running using that. So whenever I need to edit, I just go to the Code Server URL.
Stephen, does that allow for collaboration between two developers? So if they were both connected to the same server, the same file, would you have the ability to collaborate and see kind of like live updates to that file from one person to another?
It's a good question. I don't know. I haven't tried that.
Okay.
Well, even if this particular piece doesn't, VS Code does have a pair programming. I haven't used it in a very long time, but VS Code does have a pair programming plugin that does, it just basically connects you to one instance and you can.
I would like to say that I'm not suggesting you let your friends connect to your LAN so that you guys can all code in one spot. I was just curious if from a larger, like more corporate organizational structure, if that was something that was possible.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that, John. I do know that kind of related to this plugin called Remote SSH, they have another one called, I don't remember the name, but it's similar to what Nick's talking about, but you can actually have VS Code look at the containers that are running on an SSH or at an IP address, and it will connect to the container as well. So like if you're running, even on your local machine, if you're running Lando, you can run this other plugin. I think it's called Remote Host SSH. I don't remember the actual name. But it will pull up, VS Code will pull up those containers and will allow you to connect to the container and install VS Code there as well. So you get direct access very quickly to those machines. So this was just a game changer for the work I was doing. So all the troubles I went through for months with NFS and Samba completely disappeared with VS Code, with Remote SSH, because like we could set up these environments and then someone could very quickly, and the performance of it is so good that it's almost like it's on your local machine. And I went as far as like I installed one of my development environments for one of my apps out on a droplet. And so that's over the internet. And the performance was just as good as it was doing this in my local LAN. I couldn't see much of a difference.
Wow.
And when you're using VS Code and you're using like plugins like GitLens, those are very intense, like high intense file sharing and file updates with GitLens. I don't know if you guys use that, but it's connected to Git and giving you all your change updates and stuff. It works actually beautifully.
So the third part of this, right, is the browser, and like how do you is it as simple as just like typing in a link from your browser because it's on your network and things just work, or is there some
No,
additional
of course
config
not.
there?
Right. Yeah. So if anyone, because we're sort of doing Drupal and talking about Docker things, if you look at Lando or DDev, I have experience with both of those, not with Doxel, but I assume it's very similar. Those tools are designed that you are running those containers on your local machine, but they have configurations you can use. So you set up Lando running on the Linux headless machine, and you can configure it so you can access it from other computers on your network. So that takes care of the browser side. Both, I know for sure Lando and Docker both have configurations for that. I've used them both. And I'm not sure about Doxel. So you need to do a little different configuration on Lando and DDev. But once that's set, you're basically on your local machine using your browser, basically by putting a specific IP and port number in, and you're up and running.
Okay. So just to run through it, like getting started steps at a really high level. If I got this right, let me make sure I got this. So like get a Linux machine. You're using, in your case, a Nook, but it could be really any Linux machine, any machine capable of running Linux, right? Get VS Code set up to kind of access that remotely via SSH. And then, basically just learn a little bit about Linux to be able to kind of migrate through the environment. And you should be good to go, right?
Yeah, and configuring your LAMP stack to be able to be accessible from anywhere on your LAN is the other key piece. I do have a blog post that will be out when this show, so it will be in the show notes, that kind of highlights setting this environment up. So you could, I'll put that in the show notes so anyone could reference some of the things that I ran into and ways to get around them, and basically this basic configuration.
Well, Stephen, thank you for joining us for the last 4 weeks. It's been a pleasure having you back on. Feels like old times, and you're obviously welcome back anytime. We'll have to do this again.
Yeah, it's super fun to be here.
If you have questions or feedback, reach out to Talking Drupal on Twitter with the handle Talking Drupal, or via email at show@talkingdrupal.com. You can connect with our hosts and other listeners on Drupal Slack in the Talking Drupal channel. If you're interested in show news, upcoming Drupal camps, local meetups, and Chad's book corner, sign up for our newsletter at talkingdrupal.com/newsletter.
And you can promote your Drupal camp on Talking Drupal. You can learn more about this at talkingdrupal.com/camp promo.
Thank you, patrons, for supporting Talking Drupal. Your support's greatly appreciated. You can learn more about becoming a patron at talkingdrupal.com and choose Become a Patron in the sidebar.
And Stephen, if our listeners wanted to get in touch with you, what's the best way to do that?
Reach out to me on Twitter, Stephen Cross, Stephen with a PH.
And how about you, John?
You can find me on all the social networks at John Picozzi, as well as Drupal.org. And you can find out about EPAM at epam.com.
And listeners can find me at Nixvan, NICXVAN, pretty much everywhere.
And if you've enjoyed listening, we've enjoyed talking.
Have a good one.
Bye.
Next week.